want to welcome you to our YouTube channel, Ancient to Modern, this week. If you're wondering why we have named it that way, well, our attempt is to bring our faith from the ancient world to our world, to bring the scripture from the ancient world into the present. Truth be told, I think probably most Christians today really don't have a grasp or know much about our historic faith, and they know even less about the Bible. And what they think they know might be more damaging than not knowing. So we're going to take some time to explain some things, hopefully to reconnect folk to their history, to their faith, and to the Bible that gives that faith some meaning. So listen, I understand that there's YouTube channels with more pizzazz and fancy graphics and all that kind of stuff, and maybe one of these days we'll get there. Right now, not much pizzazz, but we are trying to just give you content. So if you hear something, you question it, you want to know a little more, please leave a comment. I guarantee you I'll get to it in a future week when we answer the questions that you ask. So today we're going to go to the first book of the New Testament that we're going to really talk about, and that's the Gospel of Mark. As I said, I think earlier, Mark is not the first gospel. I mean, it's not the first book of the New Testament. It is the first gospel. It was written around 60 A.D. Now, sometimes we are a little mistaken. We think that these Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, when in truth they weren't. Mark is the first one. And Papias, which was an early church leader in the 2nd century, he told us that Mark was written by a person who was with Peter in Rome. So our earliest tradition about this Gospel doesn't even have it coming from an eyewitness, but someone who was in conversation with an eyewitness. We also know that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke copy large segments of Mark, almost word for word. So Mark is the earliest, and if Mark was not really an eyewitness account, then neither are Matthew or Luke. So we said it's written about A.D. 60. That's about 30 years after the life of Christ, maybe even 32, 33. Why did it take so long? Well, there's two reasons. The first reason, I think, is very simple. Most of the people who were living lived at the same time, and they literally just told each other the stories. They all were aware, they all were part of the circle, they all told each other and related the stories that they heard about Jesus. But about 60, things are changing. There's a couple things going on. The first thing's going on is a lot of the early Christians were simply dying. This was a time and a place where the average human lived to be about 40 or the low 40s. Even people that lived relatively older lives then were starting to die out of natural causes. And even if you were lucky to have good health and live even longer than expected, there was a new emperor on the throne named Nero. And Nero was helping Christians die. I'm sure you've heard of him and some of the things that he did. And so in this kind of background, in this kind of circumstance, it became imperative that someone write down a written record because they wanted to remember. I don't know about your family, but a number of years ago when my grandparents were in the very latter years of their lives, on both my side and my wife's side of the family, we talked to the grandparents and said, hey, tell us about your parents. Tell us about your grandparents. What do you remember? What were some of the stories? We wanted to write those things down because we wanted to collectively remember as a family how we got to where we are. We've all done that. This is the same thing that's going on with the Gospels. They wanted to collectively remember. Now the problem is sometimes when we read Mark, plus the other Gospels, we treat these works like they are tomorrow's edition of the Chicago Tribune. Like they're relating data or giving us a journalistic blow-by-blow account. But that's just not how they function. They're telling us what's important. They're remembering what is authentic. They're remembering that which is worth to be told again and again and again down through the centuries. And so when we get to the Gospel of Mark, there's a couple things that I think we need to be aware of. First of all, most of the time when I teach my college class, I ask my students a simple question. I ask them, for those of you that have read all the Gospels through, which one is your favorite? And I ask for the Gospel of Matthew. I raise my hand, and a good number of students raise their hand as well. And when I mention the Gospel of Luke, a pretty large number raise their hands. That might be the highest number I typically get. Then I get John. John is also quite a high number as well. I'd say Luke and John are usually tied for about first. Matthew comes in a strong second. And then when I get to the Gospel of Mark, there's rarely anyone that raises their hand. And that's okay. Because Mark is written in a very simple, very basic level. If you read it in its original language, it's pretty rough. Sentence structure is bad. The number one word, the most used word in the Gospel of Mark is and. The second most is immediately, because those two words link most of the stories. And immediately Jesus went and did this. And immediately then he did that. And immediately. It's just not the best from a literary point of view. The second thing I want you to know about the Gospel of Mark that's different from the rest of the Gospels, that's the Gospel where the disciples just don't get it. They never understand what Jesus says. They're always slow to get his meaning. And so Mark is the gospel that's roughest on the disciples. Let me give you an example. You're well aware of the story where Jesus walks on the water. Disciples around the Sea of Galilee, the wind and the waves start, the storm blows up, it gets quite rough. Disciples are straining, they're trying to get back to land, but the storm is not letting them. They're fearful for their very lives. Matthew and Mark both has Jesus looking out, seeing that they're straining and deciding that he would walk to where they are. And in both those occasions, they look, they see Jesus, they're immediately terrified because they think it's a ghost. And Jesus in both cases says, "Fear not, it is I, don't be afraid." Jesus goes to where they are. Matthew has a little separate story about Peter walking out to meet him. Outside of that, the stories match. Jesus gets into the boat, and when he gets into the boat, immediately the wind and the waves stop. Now, here's where the stories get different. When the wind and waves stop, in Mark, the disciples say they still did not understand because their hearts were hardened. But not in Matthew. In Matthew 14, same story. When Jesus get in the boat and they get to land, in Matthew, that's the first place where the disciples understand who Jesus is. They say, "Surely you must be the Son of God." That's a pretty big difference. Same story, same facts. One is used to show how the disciples don't get it. In Matthew, that's the story where the disciples do get it. Now, I'll get to why that is in just a second. The other thing that happens in Mark is there's something called the Messianic secret. That sounds like an academic term, and maybe it is, but if you read through Mark, when Jesus does a miracle or does some great thing, frequently he tells the disciples, "Don't tell anybody who I am," or "Don't tell anybody what I've just seen," in a way of keeping things quiet. That's not present in Matthew, it's not there in Luke, it's not there in John. But only in Mark does Jesus go around telling his disciples, "Don't tell anybody about me." And we kind of wonder why that is. Probably the best answer is that's a literary device used in the ancient world in some pieces of literature to kind of identify who the hero is. You would know who it is just by that attempt to keep the hero quiet. We do the same thing. If we went and watched a whole series of westerns from the 1950s, and there's a guy riding in on a white horse and a white hat, and I ask you, is that the hero or the villain? You would say hero. You'd be right. No one taught you that. Let's update it a little bit. Not my kind of movies, and I don't like to watch them. But if you wanted to watch one of these Halloween slasher horror flicks, and you got the jock, and you got the goody two-shoes kid, and the blonde cheerleader, and they all go into the house where the axe murderer used to live. I don't know why they do that. And I ask you, who's the first one to get the axe in the head? Well, it's the blonde cheerleader. You know that, I know that. It's just how things work. In their day, you identified the hero by trying to keep it quiet. until the very end of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is hanging on a cross, and it's a Roman soldier who's given responsibility to take care of that crucifixion scene who looks up and says, "Surely this must be the Son of God." Remember, this was written in 60. It's the time of Nero. Christians are being killed. They are being impaled on sticks, covered in tar, lit on fire to light Nero's gardens, and a few other unpleasant things as well. Listen to how they might have heard it. They're being encouraged. It's okay to keep your identity a secret. It's okay to stay quiet. Don't feel the need to go broadcasting it around in a society that you might be killed for telling that story. Instead, just live good lives. And in the end, even the power of Rome will recognize that Jesus is the Son of God. There's one other thing that most of us don't know. Around that time, there were people that lived who claimed they were the Son of God. And it was their official title. And it was a Roman emperor. And they loved to consider themselves that way. And Nero in particular loved to be described in that manner. So when you have another piece of literature written around that same time saying that Jesus is the Son of God, it's a theological statement for us, but back then that was a subversive political statement. And we need to recognize that. It was kind of a subtle dig. I know the emperor has all the power, but trust me, he's not the Son of God. We know the Son of God. So keep that in mind as you read through the Gospel of Mark. And one other thing. If you look to the end, whatever Bible you have with the Gospel of Mark, some of you will find your Bible ends with verse 8. Others of you will find that your Mark ends around verse 20. Others will have both, and there'll be an asterisk or a line or something, and you'll see something to the effect of most manuscripts do not have verses 9 through 20. Well, it's probably 9 through 20 was not there to begin with. It doesn't even make an appearance till around 1,000 years later. One of the oldest copies of the book of Mark we have has burn marks after verse 8. Some scholars believe there used to be a longer ending to Mark, but we kind of lost it, perhaps in some kind of fire. Some early scribe or later scribe, seeing the burn marks, went, wait a minute, this isn't good enough. I'll add my own ending. And so they add an ending, those last 12 verses that probably weren't there to begin with. And if you read them, those are kind of weird verses. So when you read them and think they're weird, it's okay to think they're weird. They weren't there to begin with. And it's okay to kind of ignore those last 12 verses of Mark because they weren't there when Mark was first written. So anyway, that's just a little background to the Gospel of Mark. And if it's not your favorite, that's okay too. But I wanted to give you a little more idea on why Mark is there and where it came from and its timing. So anyway, remember, we're going to come back to this. If any of this causes you to have a question, feel free to leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're an atheist or an agnostic looking to prove some Christian wrong, this is your chance. You can leave a comment as well. So hey, subscribe to the channel. It's just content right now. You can like us. That would be great. Challenge us. Tell us we're crazy or ask us a question. We're fine either way. But we're looking forward to hearing from you in the future and have a wonderful week.